Welcome back to Pony Penning Day by Marguerite Henry. We last left Paul Beebe charging through the forest on Chincoteague Island after the wild ponies. Watch Eyes plunged on. There was a kind of glory in pursuit that made Paul and the horse one. They were trailing nothing but swaying bushes. They were giving chase to a mirage. Always it moved on, showing itself only in quivering leaves or moving shadows. What was that? In the clump of myrtle bushes just ahead. Paul reined in. He could scarcely breathe for the wild beating of his heart. There it was again, a silver flash. It looked like mist with the sun on it. And just beyond the mist, he caught sight of a long tail of copper and silver. He gazed, awestruck. It could be the phantom's tail, he breathed. It is. And the silver flash? It's not mist at all, but a brand new colt. The blood pounded in his ears. No wonder the phantom was a straggler. No wonder she let herself be caught. She's got a baby colt, he murmured. He glanced about him helplessly. If he could only think, how could he drive the phantom and her colt to Tom's Point? Warily he approached the myrtle thicket. Just then the colt let out a high, frightened whinny. In that little second, Paul knew that he wanted more than anything in the world to keep the mother and the colt together. Shivers of joy raced up and down his spine. His breath came faster. He made a firm resolution. "I'll buy you both," he promised. But how far had he come? Was it 10 miles to Tom's Point, or 2? Would it be best to drive them down the beach, or through the woods? As if in answer, a loud bugle rang through the woods. It was the Pied Piper, the pinto stallion in command of the herd, and unmistakably his voice came from the direction of Tom's Point. The phantom pricked her ears. She wheeled around and almost collided with Watch Eyes in her haste to find the band. She wanted the Pied Piper for protection. Behind her trotted the foal, all shining and clean with its newness. Paul laughed weakly. He was not driving the phantom after all. She and her colt were leading him. They were leading him to Tom's Point. Tom's Point was a protected piece of land where the marsh was hard and the grass especially sweet. About 70 wild ponies, exhausted by their morning's run, stood browsing quietly, as if they were in a corral. Only occasionally they looked up at their captors. The good meadow and their own weariness kept them peaceful prisoners. At a watchful distance, the roundup men rested their mounts and relaxed. It was like the lull in the midst of a storm. All was quiet on the surface. Yet there was an undercurrent of tension. You could tell it in the narrowed eyes of the men, their subdued voices, and their too-easy laughter. Suddenly the laughter stilled. Mouths gaped in disbelief. Eyes rounded. For a few seconds no one spoke at all. Then a shout that was half wonder and half admiration went up from the men. Paul Beebe was bringing in the phantom and a colt. The roundup men were swarming around Paul, buzzing with questions. "Beats all," he heard someone say. "For 2 years we've been trying to round up the phantom, and along comes a spindling youngster to show us up." "'Twas the little colt that hindered her." "Course it was." "It's the newest colt in the bunch. May not stand the swim." "If we lose only one colt, it'll still be a good day's work." The men accepted Paul as one of them now, a real roundup man. They were clapping him on the shoulder and trying to get him to talk. "Ain't they a shaggy-looking bunch?" Kim Horsepepper asked. "Except for Misty," Paul said, pointing toward the Phantom's colt. "Her coat is silky." The mere thought of touching it sent shivers through him. Misty, he thought to himself wonderingly. Why, I've named her. He looked out across the water. 2 lines of boats were forming a ponyway across the channel. He saw the cluster of people and the mounts waiting on the shores of Chincoteague, and he knew that somewhere among them was Maureen. It was like a relay race. Soon she would carry on. "Could I swim my mount across the channel alongside the Phantom?" Paul asked Wiley Maddox anxiously. Wiley shook his head. "Watch Eyes is all tuckered out," he said. "Besides, there's a kind of tradition in the way things are handled on Pony Penning Day. There's mounted men for the roundup, and there's boatmen to herd 'em across the channel," he explained. "Tide's out," he called in clipped tones. "Current is slack. Time for the ponies to be swimmed across. Let's go." Suddenly, the beach was wild with commotion. From 3 sides, the roundup men came rushing at the ponies, their hoarse cries whipping the animals into action. They plunged into the water, the stallions leading, the mares following, neighing encouragement to their colts. "They're off!" shouted Wiley Maddox, and everyone felt the relief and triumph in his words. On the shores of Chincoteague, the people pressed forward. Their faces strained to stiffness as they watched the Assoteague beach. "Here they come!" The cry broke out from every throat. Maureen, wedged in between Grandpa Beebe on one side and a volunteer fireman on the other, stood on her mount's back. Her arms paddled the air as if she were swimming and struggling with the wild ponies. Suddenly, a fisherman, looking through binoculars, began shouting in a hoarse voice. "A new-born colt is afeard to swim! Wait! A wild pony is breaking out from the mob, swimming around in the mob, escaping!" An odd murmur stirred the crowds. Maureen dug her toes in her mount's back. She strained her eyes to see the fugitive, but all she could make out was a milling mass of dark blobs on the water. The fisherman leaned far out over the water. "It's the Phantom!" he screamed. The people took up the cry, echoing it over and over. "It's the Phantom! She's escaped again!" Maureen felt tears on her cheek and impatiently brushed them away. The fisherman was waving for quiet. "It's the Phantom's colt! They won't swim!" he called out in a voice so hoarse it cracked. "The Phantom got separated from the brand fire new colt. She's gone back to get it." The people whooped and hollered at the news. "The Phantom's got a colt," they sang out. "The Phantom's got a new colt." Again the fisherman was waving for silence. "She's reached her colt," he crowed. "But the roundup men are closing in on her. They're making her shove the colt in the water. Look at her! She's making it swim!" Grandpa Beebe cupped his hands around his mouth. "Can the little feller make it?" he boomed. The crowd stilled, waiting for the hoarse voice. For long seconds no answer came. The fisherman remained as fixed as the piling he stood on. Wave after wave of fear swept over Maureen. She felt as if she were drowning. And just when she could stand the silence no longer, the fisherman began reporting in short, nervous sentences. "They're halfway across. Jumping Jupiter! The colt! It's being sucked down in a whirlpool! I can't see it now! My soul and body! A boy's jumped off the scow! He's swimming out to help the colt!" The onlookers did not need the fisherman with the binoculars any more. They could see for themselves. A boy swimming against the current. A boy holding a colt's head above the swirling waters. Maureen gulped great lungfuls of air. "It's Paul!" she screamed. "It's Paul!" And on all sides the shouts went up. "Why, it's Paul!" Grandpa leaped up on his mount's back as nimbly as a boy. He stood with his arms upraised, his fists clenched. "God help ye, Paul!" his words carried out over the water. "You're almost home!" Grandpa's voice was as strong as a tow rope. Paul was swimming steadily toward it, holding the small silver face of the colt above the water. He was almost there. He was there. Maureen slid down from her mount, clutching a handful of mane. "You made it, Paul! You made it!" she cried. The air was wild with whinnies and snorts as the ponies touched the hard sand, then scrambled up the shore, their wet bodies gleaming in the sun. Paul half carried the little colt up the steep bank. Then suddenly it found its own legs. Shouts between triumph and relief escaped every throat as the little filly tottered up the bank. For a brief second, Paul's and Maureen's eyes met above the crowds. It was as if they and the mare and her foal were the only creatures on the island. They were unaware of the great jostling and fighting as the stallions sorted out their own mares and colts. They were unaware of everything but a sharp ecstasy. Soon the phantom and her colt would belong to them, never to be sold. Dodging horses and people, Grandpa Beebe made his way over to Paul. "Paul, boy," he said, his voice unsteady, "I swim the whole way with you. You're the most wonderful and the craziest young'un in the world. Now get home, right smart quick," he added, trying to sound very stern. "You're about done up, and Grandma's expectin' you. Maureen and I'll see to it that Phantom and her colt reach the pony pens." When you go online to hear this story read, there will also be a link to the true story of the Chincoteague ponies. Thank you.